Therese, Attorney-General will now address the important issue of public-private partnerships to advance citizen security. We all know this is an important issue. So let's hear from her.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here again. Thank you, Sally, for inviting the IDB to be here. This is really important. I'm very conscious that my boss is sitting in front of me and he's up next. But a lot of ground have been covered, but I just want to say a couple things about how we see leveraging the private sector in dealing with some of our citizen security and justice issues in the region. I want to leave just a couple of statistics, I think, with you that will help you dimension this problem. And I just want to put a plug. I also brought a book for our publication on crime, which has a lot of data on the diagnostics that we've produced on crime and violence in the Caribbean. So the IDB's been working in this area for many years. The Citizen Security and Justice Program in Jamaica is probably the oldest one. It's now in its 15th, 16th, 17th year. We've got a long track record of working in the trenches on this topic. But I just want to share a couple of things. If we're talking about the private sector, what's really needed and how can we think about solving some of these issues by using public-private partnerships. So just looking at some of the work we've done, what the firms say about how much money they spend on safety of their firms. So 22% of firms that we've surveyed over the last 2 years say that crime is a major or severe obstacle to their performance. So that's a large number. 23% report losses due to crime, amounting to something like 2.5% of their sales performance, annual sales. 70% of firms actually spend money on private security. And the book has lots of data on the cost of crime overall. So we know that for the region, the 4 countries in particular that we surveyed, Trinidad, Bahamas, Barbados, and Jamaica, the total cost of crime in terms of dollar amount is anywhere between 2.5% of GDP, almost up to 5% of GDP. So Bahamas is on the higher end, Jamaica is on the lower end, and there are countries in between. And we estimate that 10%, with a 10% reduction in crime, you can get an 8% increase in sales growth in tourism-dependent economies and another 4% for commodity producers. So we know that crime is having an impact on economic opportunity and the economies in the Caribbean. Even where firms spend largely on security, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have losses due to crime. So it is a big issue, and that's one of our major findings. And this indicates that crime is a very complex problem in the Caribbean that cannot just be tackled with investment in private security alone. So we need to do other things. There's been a lot of talk about the regional cooperation on security issues and the partners that are involved in this space. I would say the IDB in Jamaica, for example, we're working with Canada, with the UK, USAID has other programs not leveraging our program, but we have 2 partners working on this. So how do we see the private sector getting involved? Obviously, in a country like Jamaica, where crime is especially important, private firms have foundations that work on certain kinds of programs with at-risk youth and in some communities that are particularly disadvantaged. That's one area. Some firms are actually directly supporting by providing resources for working in communities. And then there are programs where there is, a bit of both, some direct involvement and some indirect involvement. We think by creating business networks that can also be helpful. So getting the private sector to actually work with the public sector to figure out what are some of the solutions that we can apply to solving this problem. Taking some examples from around the world, in the US there's some very good ones. You have a company like Target, which brings together local police, businesses, and community leaders to address criminal activity basically related to retail stores. Obviously, that's their niche. It's good to look at how some of these programs work, so they need to be evaluated. Not all of the programs around the world have been evaluated, but this one has, and there are good results from working on such a model. Also in the US, there are nonprofit organizations that work with property owners and merchants to provide activities and so on for the community, similar to the Target example. In Latin America, We haven't evaluated some of the things that work, but we know that there's a lot of encouragement of corporate volunteerism. There's Sul America Peace Parks in Brazil, for example. So there's corporate funding of victimizations in Peru and Colombia. And just organizing dialogue around these issues helps a lot. So we see that happening in Colombia and Mexico. In the Caribbean, I mentioned already, the private sector organization of Jamaica, for example, sits on a committee to help with the National Crime Plan. And are very, very much involved in a coalition around youth upliftment through employment, which is also one of the programs that the IDB is involved in. Foundations such as Sandals and Digicel Foundation, these are private corporate entities. The Grace Kennedy Foundation are all very much involved in very particular programs, working with community organizations and especially with at-risk youth to help solve this problem. What I would say is that obviously at the heart of crime and violence throughout the region, one of the main reasons why there's so much crime, I think, and the data shows, is of course the lack of economic opportunity. And until we see more investments in turning the economies around in the Caribbean, whether they're in the economies that are growing very